Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, well, welcome to the Computer Vision and Bioacoustics session. Ricardo Torres is our first speaker, and I'll just turn it over to you, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ricardo Torres. I'm from University of Campinas. I'm going to present here ongoing work regarding the use of machine learning approaches for identifying and detecting remote phenology patterns. So I'd like to acknowledge funding agency also collaborates and the students. First, I'd like to provide a kind of context of this work. This work has been developed in the context of the Eco-phenology project, which is a joint collaboration between us, from Institute of Computing at UNICAMP, and the phenology laboratory, whose head is Professor Patricia Morellato from UNESCO. So basically, in this project, we are interested in obtaining and performing analysis on phenology data. Phenology can be seen as a kind of scientific studies of any kind of periodical biological phenomena that can be somehow correlated with climate conditions. In general, the typical approach is based on combining on-the-field observations with different kinds of measurements, for example, based on remote sensing images, and in order to come up with models that somehow explain how phenology evolves over time. And what you plan to do, what we're doing in this project is to include a new set of technologies to support data acquisition by using digital cameras. So basically, we are proposing middle scale approach, which is concerned with we are interested in obtaining a kind of photos based on cameras. The idea is to somehow understand phenological phenomena by taking into account features extracted from those images. And one of the targets is also provide new approaches for data acquisition so that phenology experts do not need to go to the field and make their observations. The main objectives of this project are therefore to propose a new set of technology for supporting remote phenology monitoring, and also come up with different strategies, models, methods, and algorithms to process this data obtained with these new technologies. For further information, please check our website. In this particular talk, we are interested in addressing this identification problem. We would like to guide phenology experts on finding individuals in the target region which might be of interest in terms of observation from the field. We also would like to support different mining perspectives, in the sense that we may come up with new unexpected correlations among different species. And of course, since different plants are correlated with different kinds of animals, such as insects, by providing this kind of identification approach would also to support ecosystem understanding. Okay, regarding dataset creation, we have installed a camera on top of a tower, and we have been obtaining this kind of image. And the novelty here is, okay, there are some other initiatives, but most of them are related or have been proposed in the context of temperate regions, which usually have a fewer number of species in comparison with a tropical species. So to the best of our knowledge, this is one of the first initiatives to fill this gap. Concerning our study area, we have been working on a region. It's a Cerrado region, which is a very typical vegetation in Brazil. The results that we're going to present here concern the use of machine learning to support the identification process is based on a data set obtained from August to October, which is which refers to the kind of the main leafing season, in the sense that, from the image perspective, we expect that to have a kind of greening phenomena for most of the species. And with the help of phenology experts, we defined some target regions that could be used to guide our machine learning approaches. Usually, this initial step is based on the definition of specific masks, each one for each target species. And by extracting the average color information, green, red, and blue information, which is the commonest approach for encoding phenological behavior over time, we have been obtaining this kind of time series. As you can see, depending on the region, different patterns are have been found. For example, in the case of the first two species here, you have a kind of greening pattern, in the sense that you have higher green values at the end of the time series, in the specific period that I have mentioned before. For these species, the behavior is different. You have a kind of stable, you have a kind of stable behavior of the time series, which is expected given field observation. So our first steps in this project was to correlate the features that have been extracted from image with data obtained from field observation. And as you can see, for evergreen species or for deciduous species which have the greening, a well-defined greening season, we were able to more or less correlate our image-based data. Okay, machine learning. So how do you model our identification problem using machine learning and computer vision techniques? So basically, given the set of images, we extract the time series based on, in this particular example, on color information. And each time series or set of time series are related to specific regions in the image. And we model our feature space for image classification as a problem of finding appropriate cluster of time series, using the time series values to guide the learning process. Well, the main challenge here is concerned with the fact that you have a small sample size, the small sample size problem, which is related to the fact that we need, clever machine learning approaches to learn what is going on based on on small samples. And also we face some problems regarding the asymmetry in training, in the sense that you have much more examples of unknown or targets that are not of interest than samples from the target species. And as you can imagine, we also face a lot of real-world challenges, you know. Depending on the season, you can have, as you can see in this picture, some gaps in our data because of, you know, in this case, our arm broke and we miss a lot of data. So we need to deal with that in our machine learning approach. Another issue, you're going to illustrate using this particular video here. We have some problems concerning shadows of the tower. Let me repeat again. Okay. And also there are some distortion caused by the changes in the arm. So we need to come up with you know, registration and image alignment procedures to correct the image. Okay, we developed a kind of approach based on 3 steps. The first one is based on perform a kind of multi-scale segmentation, and the second step we perform a kind of feature extraction based on different regions defined for each scale, and in the third step we perform training using a kind of multi-scale approach. Okay, regarding segmentation, this is a kind of segments that we obtain. Here a kind of zoom for a specific region in the image. For each region, for each scale, we extract appropriate features. In this particular case here, we use the average green, red, and blue information. So we're focused on color information in this result that I'm going to present here. And for multi-scale training, we are using a multi-scale classifier based on AdaBoost, which basically tries to combine the opinion of different weak classifiers. In terms of classification, we combine 5 scales, 3 bands, 13 timestamps, which represent a total of 195 classifiers. And to illustrate our results, we selected 2 important species, Aspidosperma and Meconia, defined appropriate masks for performing training. And part of the mask were used for training, part of the mask were used for testing, and we obtaining this kind of result. I'd like to emphasize here that another important aspect of this project is concerned with the fact that we have been obtaining different images for different timestamps along the day. So we have been obtaining 5 images per hour from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. So this is the reason that the output of these different classifiers are quite different, of course, depending on different lighting and color conditions. And in this particular work, we are also interested in determining, you know, the most appropriate time for observing a given species and for performing classification. And regarding classification accuracy, we observed that yes, different species present different patterns in terms of color information. And another interesting result is concerned with the fact that early and late hours are very useful for identifying correctly those species. So just to illustrate, how this approach could be used in a real-world scenario. A phenology expert would, for example, select a mask, as you can see here, and by using our approach, we could generate other possible regions in which they could observe the same species. And so to sum up, to summarize what we have been discussing so far, we proposed a kind of multi-scale classification approach for performing the identification of target species in a kind of phenological study environment. And we found out that yes, we can use this approach to identify this kind of image, and also we found out that some specific characteristics that were not expected before, for example, that extreme hours are useful for this kind of analysis. What you plan to do is to perform correlation with climate variables, with also to consider all kinds of individuals and of a single species in order to perform more experiments with our approach. And also we have been proposing a set of new representations for improving the classification results. In particular, we started work on texture information, and the results are very good as well, and we submitted it to a journal. We also developed new approaches to encode and to compress a little bit the representation. The idea here is, instead of using the whole set of images, we select just those pixels which are related to the target species, and we generate what we name a visual rhythm, which is a kind of very nice representation of each individual. And those results here concerning the use of this representation will be presented in September in the ICIP conference. We also we are trying to evaluate other approaches to characterize time series. In this particular work, we investigated different shape-based methods. The idea here, for example, is to consider a time series as a kind of open contour and take advantage of existing shape-based representation methods for deal with possible noise found in our data. And we're going to present those results in July in IGAR's conference. This is a kind of example of results that we have obtained, and as you can see, depending on the time of the day, we have a different behavior in terms of time series representation using shape information. And again, extreme hours seem to be more promising in terms of classification and retrieval. Future developments, we have been installing now cameras on different sites with different kinds of vegetation. So we for sure face new problems regarding data acquisition, and also new challenges in terms of phenological pattern recognition. And we also plan to go to another scale and also use our machine learning methods to identify similar regions, from images obtained by drones or similar or using similar technology. And we believe that by using that, we're going to have a more powerful framework for phenology, to support phenology studies. Okay, and I'd like to invite you all for, discuss a little bit more on some of achievements in the context of this project. In the Demo Fest session, we're going to present a desktop tool for managing the time series and obtaining images, and also some prototypes on developed for portable devices to support data acquisition in the field. So I'll be glad to present some other results during the demo session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Just a sec.
Is your database available?
The data set, you mean? Not yet. Currently, there is another branch of this project which is concerned with the development of information system. We are defining the databases, defining the most typical queries based on the phenology expert needs. And sometime maybe this year we're gonna make part of this data available in the website of the project. Please keep in touch so that we can let you know when our tool is available online. Okay.
So eventually then.
Yes.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I have a quick question. It seemed at the end you were indicating that you will be adding additional sensors that have a wider scale of view. Mm-hmm. Do you plan to use the the local phenology sensors, the local cameras, to validate the larger ones as you work out?
Yes, this is one of our particular goals. Is to understand the correlation, among data obtained from different scales, and maybe to understand a little bit more about what kind of noise is associated with each data obtained on different scales, and how to deal with this noise more properly in phenological models.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Very good. Thank you again.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Paul Rowe from the Queensland University. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, Queensland University of Technology. You all set?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So my name's Paul Rowe. I'm from Queensland University of Technology. What I want to do is to talk a bit about some of the bioacoustic sensing work which we've been doing. I'm going to give a bit of an overview of some of the analysis techniques that we've been using, and I'll also give a bit of background about the technique and why we think it's a good technique. First of all, let me just point out where I'm from. So this is Brisbane in Australia. It's a great place. I invite you all to visit. If you're interested in visiting, please get in touch. Okay. So the background and motivation for this work is as follows. It's interesting. I work with a lot of ecologists, and I'm a computer scientist. And when I talk to the ecologists, they often use similar language that I'm used to using. They talk about systems and services, but they're talking about the Earth in terms of systems and services. And they talk about the services that the Earth provides to us and the impacts that we have on the Earth. So there's a feedback loop here, and of course it's important to understand what's going on. So in order to better understand the system and to be able to better manage the system, you need to be able to monitor what's going on. And this is, originally Galileo's, make things countable so that you can better measure them. So what we want to do is to get better information about the health, if you like, although I understand that's a bit of a controversial term to ecologists, about the sort of the health of the environment, so we can better understand what's happening to the world. So Australia is classed as megadiverse, just as Brazil is. So it means that there's a very large and intriguing biota in Australia. We've got lots of weird and wonderful animals, just as you have here. Australia also is, I guess we've sort of suffered from a lot of problems of rare species becoming kind of extinct over the years. The Australian ecology is quite fragile, it's very dry continent. Australia, like Brazil, we're an exporter, we export a lot of sort of food, so the natural environment is very sort of important to Australia, so it's something that needs to be sort of preserved for many reasons. The sort of traditional way that monitoring is done for fauna is sort of like this. Essentially, it's very sort of manual. It involves a lot of in-the-field observation. It's possible to monitor floral biodiversity using remote sensing, by using kind of, you can use UAVs or sort of satellite imagery and things like that. And ecologists will often talk about those things being kind of proxies for the faunal biodiversity. So they'll measure sort of flora and use that as a proxy for the faunal diversity. But when they actually do want to measure faunal diversity, the way that they do that is actually by going into the field. So it actually involves lots of people going into the field and taking observations, and obviously that's sort of a very error-prone, difficult and expensive sort of process because of the people that are involved. You might also deduce, if you look at these slides, that it's also sort of prerequisite to be an old guy with a beard and a hat. That's not necessarily the case, though. So what we want to do is we want to find a tool for measuring faunal biodiversity. So the idea that we have is to use acoustics for this as this tool. So we want to use acoustics by essentially sort of listening to the environment. I used to sort of talk about putting tape recorders out into the environment, but then I realised that most of my students didn't understand what tape recorders are. And later on I'll talk about CDs, and I realise that now a lot of students don't even know what CDs are, so I'm sort of running out of ways of explaining this. But essentially what we want to do is to put out some sort of recording devices into the environment to sort of give the scientists, if you like, lots of sort of ears, so we can give them sort of extended ears and many ears so that they can listen to the sort of the health of the environment, listen to all the species that are there, and get an idea about what's going on. So let me just play you some sound to see if this will work. It's not working, is it? Okay. So there was meant to be some sound playing there. We'll continue, I guess. Let me just check that my volume's up here. So the issue is how do we analyse this sound? We're going to record all of this sound out in the environment. We're going to put lots of sensors out there. So we're going to have all this sound coming in. So how are we going to analyse it? It actually goes a bit more than that. So it's more than just scaling observations. So it's more than just getting lots more observations than we could make if we were only using people. It's also about this idea of having what we call an acoustic observatory. So the idea of the observatory is that we end up with this sort of permanent record of the environment. And this is really, really important because there aren't good ways to get direct and permanent and sort of objective records of environmental health. And particularly if you want to do forms of environmental accounting, if you want to start doing things like environmental auditing, if you want to work out if there's some environmental offsetting occurring, and you actually want to be able to sort of measure that over time to see how the environment's changing, or to check whether indeed some offset is working, if there's been some development and some developer has offset the development somewhere else in exchange for rehabilitating some land to make sure that the environment of that is meant to be, so the health of that piece of environment is meant to be improving. You need some sort of record of this. The great thing about acoustics is you get this sort of record, you get this sort of permanent record that you can go back to. So it's not just about scaling the observation, it's about having this permanent record that you can go back to. And it also means that you can go back to this record to reanalyze it. So this old sort of saying about one person's, person's sort of a noise being another person's signal also holds here. So if someone's been doing some sort of monitoring just for one particular species, other people can go back to the data and reinterrogate it. So just as with an astronomical observatory, you can go back and reinterrogate the data, you can do the same thing here. Okay, so that's a very, very brief overview of the motivation for why you might want to use sound as a way to not just sort of scale observation, but also to have this sort of permanent record of the environmental health so that you can kind of re-query it, and so that you can also have this sort of permanent record about the environment, about what's been sort of occurring there. So what I want to do now is just to give a bit of an overview of how you can kind of actually achieve that analysis. So I'm not going to drill into a lot of detail. I'm going to keep it sort of fairly high level, but I'm happy to sort of talk about some of the details if you wish, or point you towards papers. Okay, so let's try some more sound and see if this will work. So this is a whoops, that's not what I wanted. This is a spectrogram, which is a visual representation of the sound. Playing. Do we have any sound? Okay. Yeah, it's playing or not. that wasn't the sound. Anyway. I don't think that's it. That's meant to be a frog pond anyway. We'll move on. So essentially what we want to do is we've got sound which looks like this, and I'll come back to how it looks because that's kind of important too. So this is a visual representation of the sound. This is a sort of a spectrogram, and we want to sort of annotate it to understand what's actually going on. So we want to annotate so we can kind of see, if you like, within the sound what the particular kind of calls are. So here we've got these are all Australian birds, so you won't know them, but we've got a sort of a bunch of different birds calling. This is sort of a bit of a pun here, because if you actually look, we've actually got two birds calling at the same time. So this is analogous. I've called this the cockatoo problem. It's analogous to what's called the cocktail problem in cognition and in speech recognition, where you're trying to understand what people are saying when you've actually got many people speaking at the sort of the same time. So this is one of the sort of the issues that we've got with dealing with sort of sound. The other issue with sound and processing sound is that we end up with a lot of it. So we've got about we haven't got petabytes of data. We've got about 100 terabytes of data that we've accumulated so far. So it's a bit like nature's iTunes. Okay, so we've got all this sound that's being kind of recorded 24/7. We're keeping all of the sound because we want to have this this kind of acoustic observatory, right? And then we need to sort of somehow analyze all of this data. So all the sounds pouring in from all of our sensors. We want to analyze it somehow and come out with some sort of graphs about what's happening to the environment. So essentially what we've done is, rather than having to have sort of armies of people go out into the environment and make observations, we've translated that problem into a data analysis problem. Okay, so now instead of needing armies of people to go out and make the observations, in effect we need armies of people to listen to all of this sound if we were going to listen to it. This is how we started thinking about the problem. This is how I started thinking about the problem. This doesn't work. So the kind of classic approach, the approach that a computer scientist like me would take, is to say, okay, so what we've got is we've got the sort of the sound at the top here, and somehow we need to understand, every let's be careful not to swear here. Every sort of click, whistle, and noise in the sound. Okay, So that's a sort of a classic reductionist approach. It's saying, we've got this sound, we want to understand everything in the sound. I want a magic black box that's going to understand everything, and then I'll have this sort of fully annotated data which I can then feed into Excel and do all of my analyses on to understand how the environment is sort of changing. And that's what, if you use something like kind of SoundHound to work out what a tune is, or Siri or something like that, that's kind of what you'd expect. But it doesn't really work. The issue is that developing kind of recognizes that are expensive. People like Microsoft have invested, I don't know how much, but I'm guessing it must be millions, if not tens of millions of dollars into doing kind of things like speech recognition, and it only works very well if you've got a very clean channel and if it's English and all these other things. We've got a lot of variation in sound, so species communicate in many different ways. And we've got this very low signal-to-noise ratio. We've got lots and lots of noise, and we've got classic things like this cocktail problem that we know are really hard and which we can't even solve with millions of dollars of research into human speech processing. So really trying to sort of do it this way in terms of having this magic black box just doesn't quite work. And the other thing is that the scientists won't trust the results either. So even if you do this, even if you've got this magic black box, the ecologists are not going to believe that, if you just give them this list of species that you've sort of auto-magically produced from the sound file, the ecologists aren't going to believe it anyway. So the classic, and I guess the classic sort of problem-solving approach is to completely skirt around the problem and to solve a different problem. And the different problem is this, is to say that the problem is not to analyse all this sound completely automatically. The problem is we've got a small amount of the user's time. We've got maybe an hour of the user's time, so as a scientist, the scientist may be prepared to spend half an hour analysing the data, but in that hour of time that they use for analysing the data, we actually want to analyse, say, a week or a month's worth of sound. Okay, so we're not saying we want a magic box. What we're saying is that we want to be able to just use the user's time very sort of efficiently. The other thing is that so what that really means is we're taking a holistic view and we're thinking about the whole system, including the users. So if you actually look at the ways that you can actually analyse sound then, and you actually sort of bring the users into the picture, you see that there's quite a few different ways. We could take a manual approach. We could have a sort of a semi-automated approach where the users are actually interacting with the system to do some interactive data analysis. Or if we do have an automated approach, we're going to need the user to get involved in some amount of training and certainly verification of the results. So all of the forms of analyses which we now look at incorporate users. They always have done. It's just that before we were rather blinkered in what we were doing. And if we bring users into the picture, we can do a lot more interesting things. So what have we actually done? Well, the first thing is that if you're going to do these sorts of tests and experiments, you need some existing data set. So we've actually gone ahead and we've actually done a complete manual analysis of 3 days of data. We've employed a bunch of bird watchers to completely analyse this 3 days of data. So we've got some sort of ground truth. We've got a test data set which we can use. And people are doing speech analysis and things like this. This is one of the first things you do, and other speakers have mentioned this. You need this existing data set to actually sort of test what you're doing out on. So we've got we've got tens of thousands of these annotations in this data. And I guess the important thing about this graph is that there's a long tail. So there are a few in this case these are birds. There's a few birds in our survey that call very often and a lot that don't call very often. So this is what we call our weapons of mass detection. So this is a set. Each of these is the work of a research student. And these are the techniques that we've used for doing some sound analysis. So the first trick, I guess, is not to listen to all the data. You record all of the data, but you just do some sampling. So you do some classic time-based sampling, and you can kind of work out that even by just doing a small amount of sampling, if you do it at the right time, so dawn and dusk typically for birds, or in Australia, if you want the amphibians and things, you do it just after it's been raining, then you can actually get a high percentage of the species. So just by doing some sort of randomized sampling around dawn and dusk. Another approach, which originally I was going to call the Radio Times approach, but you need to be English to understand that, is the sort of guided listening approach. And what we do here is we're extracting a bunch of different indices, which give a different metrics for giving a holistic overview of the sound. So we look at measures of sort of entropy, acoustic complexity, variation in intensity and things like this. We're now looking at kind of doing false colour imagery, a bit like the false colour satellite imagery, and you can use that to kind of guide users to where, from a, I guess from an information theoretic point of view, there's some sort of interesting things in the signal. Another approach is where, rather than sort of have this problem of a recognizer, which is expensive to develop, is you have some more general recognizers and you let the users sort of build up these recognizers. So we employ here a sort of a syntactic pattern recognition approach where we have these pattern recognizers for recognizing different bits of the signal corresponding to sort of wideband noise, clicks and whistles and things like that. And then we can kind of combine those in different ways, just as in an editor you might kind of combine different graphic elements and things like that. Another approach is to say we don't listen to the sound at all because humans are very visual, and we can actually scan through the sound visually. So for some particular calls, we can kind of scan through the sound. For example, these koala calls here, and they're fairly easy to recognize. And so just by sort of fast forwarding through those spectrograms, we can get at least an order of magnitude improvement over actually listening to the sound. Final approach is, one of the final approaches that we're looking at is bird watchers. So we're actually leveraging bird watchers. And unlike kind of more tasking-based citizen science approaches or crowdsourcing-based approaches, we're sort of trying to take this sort of army of dedicated bird watchers and to sort of translate their real-world pastime into a virtual pastime. And that's quite new. No one's done that kind of thing before, to take a real pastime and actually translate it into a virtual space. So we're actually trying to translate the bird watcher's pastime of going out into the field and listening to birds and trying to sort of do that in a virtual space where they actually listen to sound and trying to effectively sort of emulate the, some of the sort of social things that go on during a bird walk. This is just some of our sound recording hardware, some of the devices and things that we use. We've got a number of projects. This is only a small smattering of the projects, but where we've been working with, for example, this gastric mouth-brooding frog, which is considered to be sort of extinct, where we're trying to find if there really still are some of them around. Working with koalas. Koalas make an interesting bellowing sound to try and locate those. And many other things, working with cryptic bird species and the like. So sound, to conclude, sound offers a promising approach to monitoring the environment. It produces a lot of data, which is sort of interesting if you're interested in sort of big data and things like that. It's difficult to analyse sound, but if you sort of bring the users in and consider the users as being part of your analysis, then that actually sort of simplifies the problem and gives you a lot more other interesting opportunities in terms of analysing the sound. So in general, I think that there are a lot of interesting e-science research problems in sound and bioacoustics, and it's particularly interesting once you bring the users in because you get a lot of interesting sort of HCI issues and things that creep in. I'd like to acknowledge my team and research students and Microsoft Research who sort of supported this work, and thank FAPESPI, not sure if I pronounced that right, and Microsoft Research for inviting me. Thank you.
Okay, well, I have like hundreds of questions that came up in my mind, but let's start with you.
Part of the data that you are dealing with is based on crowdsourcing.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of technologies people are using in order to make that data available or for data insertion and so on?
Yeah, so the crowdsourcing I was referring to there was the crowdsourced analysis of the data. So this is where we've already recorded the data. But we do have also projects where we've actually got users going out and recording sounds with phones and the like. So I've just got a student who started looking at that now. So they're actually sort of recording, animal sounds using a mobile device, and the idea is that it's then going to be sort of uploaded and analysed on a server. But
how many people would have enough expertise for, providing the correct labeling for
about 20 million in, sorry, yeah. So the question was how many people would have the expertise to do the sound labelling. So several answers to that. First of all, there are a lot of bird watchers. So in the US, there's about 20 million bird watchers, about 20,000 in Australia. We're also sort of looking at how you can actually sort of train people that are interested in doing that kind of analysis. So there are quite a lot, and yeah, we'll see, I guess, in the end.
A question I have is, you're sort of talking about taking the signal without doing the species identification and calculating SNR and so forth, and your ultimate goal is ecological health. Is there, how is your thinking in regard to using species identification as an intermediate step versus just skipping over that and looking at ecological health as a function of the spectrum, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's something we've looked at or are looking at. I don't think we've got a definitive answer to that. So the analogy would be something like a library where you might say, okay, so without actually being understand what people are saying and what a library is, if you have some sort of data about a library and the sounds in a library, you might say, well, if it's completely quiet, that's probably not healthy. If there's a lot of noise, there's some party going on, that's probably not healthy. But if you hear, if there's just sort of shuffling of chairs and things without actually being able to analyse it and work out that shuffling of chairs, but just from a signature, you might know that's a healthy environment for a library. So yeah, it's a great research question. We started off looking at that. I think now we're moving more towards this idea of just using it as a guide to guide users to sort of search through the data. But yeah, it's a fascinating question because it is signal. That's the thing. It is signal. It's not the species are making these sounds to communicate, and it's deliberate. So it's signal. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions before we move on? Yes. I got it.
Have you thought about mimicking the sound to trigger the animals to make more sounds?
Yes, but in some ways we're trying to get away from that. So one of the ways that the ornithologists monitor the cryptic species is by doing call playback. And that's not sort of good. You need to get ethical clearance and things for that, and you're actually disturbing the environment and potentially attracting more birds in by doing that playback. So by doing this sort of passive monitoring, you actually get a better idea about the species that are there because you're disturbing the environment less. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much, Paul, and we'll move on. And our next speaker is Alan Hanbury, Vienna University of Technology. I'll give him a minute to...
So, good afternoon. I'll be talking about a cloud-based evaluation infrastructure for medical image analysis and search. Now, as we've seen today, there are many tasks that people wish to automate by computer. So we take two at random. It could be finding relevant documents in a large document collection, or it could be segmenting the organs in radiology images. Now, if you have such tasks, there are many people who will write algorithms to solve these tasks. So you end up with many algorithms which solve the same tasks. And you don't know which is the best one. So basically, what you want to do is line all the algorithms up give them a task, let them loose on the algorithms, see how they perform, and see the reasons why they perform as they do. So this is where evaluation comes in. So there are many evaluation activities that are organized. So they could be called, for example, evaluation campaigns, challenges, benchmarks, competitions. And basically this is where the organizers make available data and tasks for participants to try out their algorithms on. And such evaluation activities actually make economic sense. So one of the activities that has been going for the longest is organized by the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, and this is the TREC campaign. And after almost 20 years of running this, they asked an independent organization if running this evaluation campaign makes economic sense. And this organization came up with the result that for every $1 that NIST invests in the TREC evaluation campaign, there are between $3 and $5 in benefits accrued to the information retrieval researchers. Why is this? Because the information retrieval researchers don't have to, let's say, waste their time putting together the data to try their algorithms out on or creating ground truth, whatever. There are people who do this, and they get objective results to compare their algorithms on. Of course, this is also useful for companies because they get to see which algorithms work best for certain tasks. And of course, this also has scientific impact for the researchers. They publish papers on their evaluation results, and these papers get cited. So, traditionally, evaluation campaigns are done as follows. You have at the top the organizer, and the organizer has to first of all come up with some tasks that he or she wants the participants to take part in, has to find the data on which these tasks can be carried out, and also ensure that there is enough ground truth available to be able to evaluate the algorithms. Now, the ground truth could actually be quite tricky because, well, firstly, you might just have it, but if you have enough ground truth to run a successful evaluation campaign, then maybe you have to think that the task is maybe not so interesting, because if you already have the ground truth, what's the use of automating it? So in practice, what you need is a really good way of generating a really good approximation to the ground truth on a large amount of data. And there are various tricks, let's say, that you could use to do this. So let's say the organizer has all of this. It's up at the top there. And then the evaluation campaign gets launched. So basically, the participants in the evaluation campaign start connecting to the organizer. They download the tasks and the data, and they have a certain amount of time on which they can carry the tasks out on the data. When they're finished with this, they then send the results back to the organizers in hopefully the format that was defined by the organizers, and the organizer will compare these results to the ground truth and come up with an evaluation of how the algorithms performed. And then usually all of the participants and the organizers get together and they discuss the results. So that's how it's traditionally done. Now we get to the problem. What if we want to do an evaluation campaign on many terabytes of data? So let's say we have something like 5 terabytes of data. So we run into the problem, can we just ask the participants to download 5 terabytes of data and run their algorithms on this? Do they have sufficient computing power to do this? Will they run into other problems? Well, firstly, if they have a slow internet connection, it could take a long time for them to download the data. So there have been various solutions to this. A common solution is we send the data on hard disks through the post. This has been done in the TREC campaign, for example. There's a lot of overhead involved with this, and yeah, so it's not the most efficient way of doing it. So what we've been looking at is actually running these evaluation campaigns in the cloud. And there's a project called the Visceral project, which is working on this. So the idea with the Visceral project is that we want to bring the algorithms to the data, instead of bringing the data to the algorithms. Because usually the algorithms are much smaller, so you could just load them to where the data is and run them there. So the way we're doing it is we're putting the data on the cloud, and the participants in the evaluation campaign get computing instances on the cloud and get to run their algorithms on the data in the cloud. So in Visceral, we'll be running 2 benchmarks. So the first benchmark, imaginatively called benchmark 1, has to do with whole body labeling in 3D imaging data. So you see an example over there on the right of a 3-dimensional radiology image with some ground truth drawn in for the organs that need to be segmented. So basically, for the data, we're working together with some hospitals, and they are providing to us for use in the project images that have been acquired during daily routine clinical work. So basically, there's the PACS system in the hospital where all the radiology images are stored, and we're downloading those images and we'll be using them in this benchmark. And the sort of images that we're getting, so we're getting whole body MRI and CT scans like the one that you see on the right, again with some manual ground truth of the organs that should be found drawn in. We're getting some imaging of the abdomen, various other modalities like contrast enhanced CT, and which is used for oncological staging. So the participants will be provided with all of these modalities, and this multiple modality approach is useful because there's some organs that can be more easily found in some modalities than others. So why is this interesting? Why do we want participants to get these radiology images and segment all of the organs automatically? Well, in hospitals, there are very many radiology images taken routinely. So many patients who come every day and get MRI or CT scans done. And usually what happens to this data is it's put on the PACS, saved in the hospital archive, and never looked at again. So there's all this information there. Potentially it would be possible to find useful things out from it, but it's just there, nobody looks at it again. What's getting worse is the amount of imaging that's captured. So the devices are getting better and better, the resolutions are getting higher, so this means that you're getting more and more images which are just getting saved, taking up more storage space, and not being used. So if we could automatically, as a first step, locate all of the organs in these images, this is then a first step towards converting this unstructured data into structured data, and we could do some data mining on this to find out many useful insights. Now, there are very many medical research groups working on this problem of locating organs in 3D images, segmenting them, and so on. They have the problem that it's very difficult to get the data. So often, due to ethical considerations and so on, hospitals are not so happy with giving this data away for researchers to use. But because we are doing this at a larger scale, we've had some good cooperation from hospitals, so we actually have the data now. The next problem is if you're doing this alone, the manual annotation is expensive. So common approaches, if you want to do manual annotation for such an evaluation campaign, is you put it out on, let's say, the Mechanical Turk, and you ask people to do the annotation. Here we have medical images. You need experts to do a reasonable or good segmentation of such images. So radiologists in this case. And radiologists' time is expensive. So now I'm going to tell you the technical side of how we're going to run the evaluation campaign. And after the technical side, I'll tell you more about the tasks that we're going to set. So this whole benchmark is going to be run in the Microsoft Azure cloud. And we have inside the cloud a registration system. So the participants will connect to the registration system, sign up, and as soon as they've signed up, they will get access to computing instances in the cloud which are linked to the training data. In this case, they will then have 4 months to carry out the tasks that we have set on this data, so that by the end of these 4 months, what they have to ensure is that the programs which are, so the executables which carry out the tasks that are set, are installed on these computing instances. At the same time, the organizers are going to be writing an analysis system, and on the submission deadline, the participants will lose access to their computing instances. These will be transferred to the control of the organizers, and the analysis system will run the algorithms on some test data that the participants have never seen before. Now, I mentioned getting the ground truth is complex. So in addition to this, we also have what we call the annotation management system. And what this does is it sends images to a team of radiologists that we're paying with the instructions to annotate these images. Now, the nice thing about creating ground truth in this way is that we can actually look at information that is generated during the benchmark and use this to decide on which are the best images to get the radiologists to annotate. So work out how to make the best use of this quite expensive time that the radiologists are giving us. So they will generate the gold standard, and then we will, of course, compare this to what the automated systems do. So that's how the task is going to be run from a technical side. I'll now give you a bit of information on how it's going to, on the tasks themselves. So in fact, we're going to have 2 tasks. The first one we've called the multi-layered task. So basically, the participants will be getting hold of some training data, so the CT, MRI, and so on images with some manual annotations. They then have the 4 months to write or to use this data to train their algorithms so that if they are given images which are not annotated, these algorithms should produce these annotations. And at the end of the 4 months, these trained algorithms should be implemented in their computing instances. Then we move on to the evaluation phase. So of course, the participants lose control of their computing instances, and they are linked to the gold corpus evaluation. So now the organizers will run these algorithms and will look at the results that are produced by them and compare them to the ground truth. Now we know that not every research group can do everything. So there are some groups that specialize on locating sort of roughly where the organs are. The other groups that specialize on actually finding the boundaries of the organs, so doing the detailed segmentation of each of the organs. So if we just give images with no further information, there might be some groups who say, well, we can't do everything. So we've thought of that, and if groups ask for it, we will also provide additional information. So an example of additional information we could provide, even during the training stage, could be some sort of landmarks which give the locations of the organs. So for groups that can't do the location of the organs automatically, they sort of know where the organs are and can use that to seed the segmentation. So that's the first task. The second task we've called the surprise organ task. And basically the idea here is we want to give groups that are not specialized in medical imaging, but that are specialized, let's say, in machine learning, the possibility to try out their machine learning algorithms in this benchmark. So here again, we will be giving the groups the training data with the manual annotations, and their task will be to write an algorithm which, when given the manual annotations for a single organ, will learn from those how to segment that organ. So the result at the end of the training phase should be an algorithm that does things in 2 steps. Firstly, it learns, and then it applies that on data which is not labeled. So then in the evaluation phase, in the first step, we will give some example images with some organ that we've chosen and haven't told before which one it is. And then the algorithm will run through its learning stage and come up with a classifier. And then we give this classifier the unlabeled data, and it should find and segment the organ, which is then again evaluated. So this is the preliminary timeline. So we plan to open the benchmark on the 1st of August. So from then it will be possible to register to take part and to get access to the data and the computing instances. On the 26th of September, there's a workshop at the MICI on medical computer vision. So there will also be a session to discuss experiences with this benchmark. On the 30th of September, we plan to have what we call initial verification runs. So we're going to ask participants just to provide some results on a small amount of data so that we can just check that everything's running correctly. And the final closure of the benchmark, when the computing instances were passed to the organizers, is on the 30th of November. So that's what we're planning to do in the next months. We've also been thinking beyond that. So some of the problems that we have come up with but haven't solved yet are, firstly, well, we're dealing with private data. So at the moment we have the permission from the ethical committees of the hospitals to use the anonymized data to run these benchmarks on. But of course, if you do the anonymization, you could potentially lose some information that could be quite interesting to find out useful things. So does it make sense, seeing that it's not necessary for the participants to ever see the test data, that we put anonymized data as the test data, and we can run the algorithms on this, but the participants never see the data? Can the participants learn something from results on data that they've never seen? This is something we still need to think about. We're also thinking of moving it towards e-science, so putting in some data identifiers so it's possible to cite the data. We're also thinking, is it possible to come up with algorithm identifiers? So this is the algorithm that produced these results. At the moment we're running this in that we have some deadlines, so the algorithms should be submitted by a certain deadline. But of course, it would be possible to run this continuously. So whenever somebody wants to try out some algorithms on the data, they could submit it and within a reasonable amount of time get the results back. So this is something that we're looking into implementing. And finally, another problem that I've mentioned is that there could be some groups that write algorithms for locating organs. There could be other groups that write algorithms for segmenting organs. Of course, it makes sense to put these algorithms together. So you first run the location algorithm, then the segmentation algorithm. You get, of course, here lots of combination possibilities. What's the best combination of organs, of algorithms from different groups? Can we test this out? And some even longer term challenges. So at the moment, we're running the benchmark on the Microsoft Azure cloud. So we're getting support from Microsoft for this. But if we take it further, we want to do this in the long term, who would actually pay for using the cloud? So would participants, so research groups, let's say, be prepared to pay for their cloud time to take part? This is something we need to think about. Also the sharing of components. So if some groups, for example, provide the location components, others provide segmentation, how can we share so that these algorithms can be used together? And finally, if we have solutions that work, how can we transfer them to industry in an easy way? So the Visceral project is supported by the European Commission in the 7th Framework Program and also Microsoft Research. And remember to look at the website. You can join the mailing list to keep up to date on what's happening, because the first benchmark is opening on the 1st of August. Thank you.
All right, three excellent talks. Do we have any questions here? I see one in the back.
Hello? That works? Yes, it does.
Yep.
Thank you very much for a great talk. I have a couple of questions to ask. The first is, do you have any intention to extend this beyond image data into multimodal data sets, that kind of thing?
Yes, so the benchmark 2, which I haven't spoken about yet, the plan is that this will deal with, let's say, a more information retrieval problem. So this would be relevant case retrieval. So the use case there is that a radiologist has an image, there is something in the image which he or she has never seen before, and then he or she would want to launch a search into the hospital archives to find images with similar structures, and then also the radiology reports that are found or are attached to these images. And then, of course, once we find the radiology reports, we can bring in text search, so we can analyze these, find out words that occur in many radiology reports, then use those for text queries, and so on.
And another question. Actually, you mentioned it as an open question on your last slide, but I intend to ask you it anyway. When you're talking about transfer to industry, do you have any thoughts about how that might be accomplished?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts, but they're still in a very embryonic stage. But I can imagine, I mean, we've had some discussions with some companies who would be quite prepared to actually use the cloud if the algorithms are there and they could get access to them. We would need to work out some sort of way that the companies could then pay, let's say, the licenses to the researchers for the use of these algorithms. So I imagine there would need to be some sort of control or something on the cloud for how much it's used. But there are many ideas for how this could work.
All right, any other questions? Okay, well, let's thank our speaker again, and all three of our speakers. And thank you for attending. I think we now go out into the lobby for some happy hour and demo fest, so I hope we'll all be able to join us. Thank you.